Over the course of the Mario Kart series, there have been a lot of track themes that repeat themselves. Every single game in the franchise has its own Mario Circuit, kinda, Rainbow Road, and Bowser's Castle. On top of those three though, there have been plenty of themes that do miss out on a few titles but are still pretty prevalent nonetheless. There's plenty of Yoshi tracks throughout the series, a ton of city tracks, and even biome-based stuff like deserts. But of these themes, one type stands out above the rest. For being terrifying. Almost every game in the Mario Kart series has had a Boo-based track. Simply hovering over them on the course selection screen is enough to terrify even the most fearless 8-year-olds. Actually playing these courses is even worse, and it's not because of the horrific ghosts filling the atmosphere or even the eerie music set behind each and every one of them. It's because most of these are kind of mid. Yeah, in almost every Mario Kart game, I've found the ghost tracks to be on the more mediocre side. Not even necessarily bad, they just never stand out as much of a highlight to me. Which is a shame because I like spooky things, look at how many FNAF references I make. Welcome to another episode of Level by Level. Today I want to take a look at all the ghost tracks in the Mario Kart series to see why I think most of them are so mediocre. I know a lot of you want to see Bowser's Castle, but it's Halloween time, I have an excuse. Over the course of the series, there have been 9 ghost tracks and 7 remakes, for a total of 16 that we have to cover today. As always, we'll be throwing them into a tier list, though this video's tier list is going to be pretty whack because I have equal views on most of these. The tier list is just a ghost track list, meaning an S tier here isn't necessarily an S tier if every track in the series was considered. With all that said, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump right in. To kick us off, we have not 1, not 2, but 3 tracks from Super Mario Kart. That's the scariest bit of this whole video. Obviously, Super Mario Kart is the worst Mario Kart game due to it being the first. I mean, it's fine for what it was, but it's not something I would ever choose to go back to unless I'm making a video. Part of the reason it is so whack is because of the repeating track themes. Despite there being 20 tracks in the game, there are only 6 actual themes. So that's why this game got 3 different ghost tracks, Ghost Valley 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, all 3 of them share the exact same aesthetic, so I guess we can start there. These are clearly based on the ghost houses seen in Super Mario World. Of the themes in this game, I can at least say this is probably one of my favorites. I think the boos flying in the background give these tracks a totally different feel from the rest, and that's especially added onto by the dark void under each of these. Besides Rainbow Road, these are really the only tracks in the game you can fully fall off on. Sure, in Bowser's Castle you can fall into lava, but there's just something more scary about falling into the abyss. I jump into volcanoes for fun. That void is made extra terrifying due to these tracks' unique gimmick. Whenever you run into a wall here, the block that you hit will be permanently erased. And that's gonna happen a lot because of how garbage the controls are in this game. That naturally makes the track get harder as the race goes on, so I think that's actually a pretty neat gimmick. The last shared element that I want to touch on before getting into each individual layout is the music. Yeah, it's definitely the worst one in Super Mario Kart. It's based on the Mario World Ghost House theme, and it's just really repetitive. The other songs in this game I at least don't mind listening to multiple times, but the Ghost Valley song does definitely get a bit grating. But with their shared elements out of the way, which of the original 3 Ghost Valleys do I think is the best? Well, let's just start by going in order here with Ghost Valley 1. This is definitely the easiest of the bunch, which is to be expected. Even just by looking at the map, you can see just how incredibly simplistic it is. The whole thing is pretty much just a rectangle without much notable on it. The first left turn gives you plenty of space, and after that, you just have a really long straightaway. The Ghost Valleys don't really have any obstacles beside falling walls, and unless you're an idiot, you're really not going to hit any of those on a straightaway. They do try to make it a little funky with a wave in the road, but you can pretty much completely ignore it existing. The turn afterward leads to another straightaway, but thankfully this one is shorter and has a jump. I also want to note that in Versus mode, a couple extra jumps are added here which I think are neat. If you manage to drift hop over them, you can even get an extra item, which I think adds a little bit more to do here. The next turn is finally what brings us to the actual interesting bit of the track. After another jump, we're given a split road. The right is a slower route that requires a few extra turns, but if you have a feather, you can jump here and make a big shortcut. Feather cuts always feel really fun in Super Mario Kart, especially since most of the games don't have the item. I also like that this can be made with a mushroom too, though it's definitely much more difficult. Unfortunately though, that's really all Ghost Valley 1 has going for it. I think it's safe to say that this is the weakest ghost track in the series, so I'm gonna be putting it in F tier. Again, this doesn't mean that it's an F tier across every Mario Kart track, but something had to be on the bottom of this ghost track tier list. Ghost Valley 2 actually has a little bit more going for us. This utilizes the wall gimmick much better right out of the gate by having several sharp turns pretty back to back. That makes it much more realistic that someone could actually fall off instead of just driving in a straight line. Quickly after the first set of turns, we also get this track's feather shortcut. It's a bit harder to see due to it not being an obvious long strip of land, but I think that makes it a bit more fun to discover. After the cuts, we get another 3 quick turns back to back, again making it quite easy to fall off. I especially like how some parts of the road have chunks taken off the edges. Not only only does that make them harder to drive around, but I think the worn down road adds to the aesthetic. The track does end on a bit of a lower note though, with quite a long empty straightaway, but this is definitely an overall step up over Ghost Valley 1. So for that, I'll be putting it in C tier. Oh yeah, D tier is dead again. Finally, we have Ghost Valley 3, which I think is my personal favorite of the set. I don't think it quite uses the wall gimmick as well as 2 does, but it makes up for that by having plenty of other ways to fall off. That's seen right after the first turn, which is a pretty long straightaway, but unlike Ghost Valley 1, there is actually stuff to do here with a jump and several holes to avoid. The 2 holes are placed in pretty scary spots too, with one being right after the turn and the other one being right after the jump, so it can be easy to end up falling in. On top of that, this straightaway also contains the feather cut, which is easily the hardest of the 3 as you have to make a pretty sharp right turn to make it. That's made even scarier by the zigzaggy turns right after it with no walls to protect you. Since there aren't any walls though, I do find it quite fun to try and hop over the corners to save a bit of time. After that, we get one pretty big turn that can definitely have us slamming into a wall if we aren't careful. I like how well this leads into the next bit of diagonal road, as it can be kind of difficult to reorient yourself after the turn without falling off, made even trickier by the hole in the middle of the road. Again though, I really like using the drift hop to try and go over these holes when possible. It feels pretty satisfying. That's especially the case on the last segment, as we now have several holes and jumps to avoid. Getting through here without falling off is always exhilarating. But after a few more wall-less bits of road, the track comes to a close. This is definitely my favorite of the original Ghost Valleys, since I think it utilized the theme the best, but with that said, it is still incredibly basic. I don't think it's that much better than the other two, because at the end of the day, they all feel pretty samey. For the added amount of holes though, I could definitely at least put this above the rest in C tier. Moving on to our second Mario Kart game, we have to ask the question, did the ghost tracks have a rough transition into 3D? No, honestly, this is exactly what you'd expect. Mario Kart 64 only had one ghost track in the form of Banshee Boardwalk. More than the other tracks with similar themes to Super Mario Kart, Banshee Boardwalk really feels like a 3D version of the Ghost Valleys. It's got that same dark and gloomy atmosphere with us driving on wood in the darkness. The extra dimension does allow for a bit more detail though, with the eerie lanterns lining the path. Unfortunately, Banshee Boardwalk didn't keep the fun wall gimmick, instead its walls will stay up in place the entire time. While there are parts without walls where you can fall off, most of the time you are fairly safe, which is a bit less interesting to me. On top of that, despite the track being in 3D, it really doesn't feel like that most of the time, since the area you're driving on is pretty flat. While that does keep it in line with the Ghost Valleys, it definitely makes Banshee Boardwalk feel a whole lot lamer than the other Mario Kart 64 tracks. That's not to say there's no ramps though, as after the first few turns we do get one. This ramp brings us right under the track's iconic fish jump scare. Now, I don't really think a Cheep Cheep of all enemies is that scary, but it certainly adds some personality to the track. After the Cheep Cheep 2, we also get to see some boos, but they're literally just boo models overlaid on the screen. I actually find these really funny the way they just spin around like that. Following the boos, we get an actual full-on dip in the road, which I think makes this feel a bit more run down. That's on top of us actually getting to go inside this weird haunted house-like structure. I really like the spooky welcome sign, but unfortunately on the inside, there's really not much to this. It's a good aesthetic break from the boardwalk, but gameplay-wise, it just ends up being a lot of pretty open turns. At least in versus mode, a ton of bats do spawn here, which can act as decent obstacles that you have to weave between. I can also say that I like this part where you could try and jump behind this pillar for an extra bit of time save. After exiting that, there's just a few more basic turns in the boardwalk and the track comes to an end. So yeah, that's about the same quality we've seen from the Ghost Valleys, and that's not great for a Mario Kart 64 track. I would say Banshee Boardwalk is the best track we've looked at so far, but compared to the rest of 64's selection, that's extremely weak. There were some fun aesthetic elements like the boos and fish, but it's not enough to make me want to go back to this. I think it belongs at the top of C tier. Oh yeah, the music on this track is definitely better than the Ghost Valleys, but I still think it's one of the weaker Mario Kart songs. Now on to Super Circuit, which has by far the most ghost tracks in the series. We got a grand total of 5, 2 originals and 3 remakes. Does that make Super Circuit the spookiest game of the bunch? No, Mario Kart World has Coin Coffer, he's horrifying. The first new track of the bunch is Boo Lake. Now, the immediate thing that everyone says when looking at this track is, where is the water? There is not a drop to be found here, below or on the track. I'm really not sure why they didn't include the titular lake, and if there were technical limitations, what's the point of calling it Boo Lake in the first place? Instead, we just got another floating wood-based ghost track. This aesthetic is getting very tiring at this point, but at least I can give Boo Lake credit for having my favorite background so far. The ominous ominous mansion and purple trees do make this pop out more than the pure voids of the last few tracks. The song is also a big improvement in my opinion. It doesn't feel nearly as repetitive and still gives off some good spooky vibes. But now let's move on to the layout of the course. Pretty much, I'd call this just a spruced up Ghost Valley. It's perfectly flat and the walls fall away when you hit them again, but there's definitely a lot more to this. After the first turn, instead of a long and boring straightaway, we get several back-to-back speed jumps, which makes the track far more exciting. That chains into a bit of a twisty turn, which can easily lead to a wall bump if you aren't careful. After that, we again see another pretty spruced up straightaway as it's divided into 3 parts. You can either go off to the sides to get some coins, or just jump the gap if you're feeling risky. I always like getting decisions like this on tracks as it makes the multiple laps feel a bit more unique. A lot of the route after this has us taking some skinny pathways and turns that keep us close to the wall, again working quite well with the wall gimmick. Eventually, we do reach a straightaway with a bunch of boos, and I do have to say that this definitely feels like a missed opportunity. The boos here are holding lanterns, leaving a pretty clear light source on the ground. Unfortunately though, the boos literally do nothing. I think these easily could have worked as some obstacles that really would have spruced up this straightaway. At the very least, the end is pretty good as you get faced with another split path. You can either turn right to go the easy route, or if you go left, you can cross a very skinny bridge for a shortcut. I'm always a fan of risky shortcuts that don't require a mushroom, as it lets anyone in any position take it as long as they're willing to take the risk. To end off the track, the remaining turns are filled with these small bumps in the road. They do make these portions slightly harder to control, but I don't really think they make a huge difference in that regard. It's kind of just fun to bounce. So overall, I would certainly say this is the best track we've seen yet. Sure, it doesn't have the 3D element of Banshee Boardwalk, but I think the gameplay here is stronger all around with several different paths and shortcuts. We're still stuck in the floating wood era though, and it's a shame they didn't at least attempt to spruce this up with the lake that the name literally promises. So for now, I think I'll put this up in B tier. Super Circuit's second original Boo track was Broken Pier, and I've heard quite negative things about this track over the years. After replaying it for this video though, I honestly think it's a bit underrated. First off, while the song and general look of the road is the same here as it was on Boo Lake, this did get its own backdrop.
The jack-o'-lantern.
I don't think I like it quite as much as Boo Lake, but I do still think it's pretty cool. As for the layout, I would say this takes the flat ghost tracks to their absolute peak. It starts pretty basic with some fairly open turns, but that quickly changes once we get here. This shows off a pretty interesting gimmick with the course. While it may seem like there's only one way to go, if you squint your eyes, you may be able to see that there's actually a bridge off to the left. The way it's colored makes it pretty difficult to see, but I honestly think that works for the track's benefit. Ghost houses in the Mario series are all about secret pathways, so having a pretty difficult to spot path makes a lot of sense. Now in this specific case, I'm not entirely sure that it's actually faster, so it is a bit pointless, but there are more bridges like this coming up. On this turn afterward, we get to see another element of this track that I really like, these tiny jump platforms. If you remember back on the Ghost Valleys, I mentioned really liking to hop over the corners. That was subtle foreshadowing to how Broken Pier implements that directly into the track's design. Most of the corners from this point on have these jump ramps, which open up for so many difficult mini shortcuts. That's even expanded on a little later on the track with the most complex segment we've seen yet. We essentially have 3 different options here. You could be a total loser and go to the far left, which is definitely the safest option, but also the slowest. If you are able to open your eyes though, you may be able to see another one of the dark bridges hanging in the void, which definitely saves quite a bit of time. However, if you have a mushroom, you can save even more time by using the boost ramps to hop across the big gap in the stage. I love having these 3 tiers of pathways to choose from as it adds so much depth to the track. Plus it helps a lot that I really enjoy anything that has to do with the bounce pads. Keeping up with that theme, the next few turns and straightaways are full of them, which are open to so much fun parkour shenanigans. We also get another bridge pick-a-path, though for some reason they didn't make this bridge dark like the other ones. After that, it's just a few more pretty standard turns toward the end. Overall, there is a ton you can do in this course. Sure, the aesthetic does make it feel a bit bland since it's our 6th basic wooden ghost track, but the gameplay is much more unique than the others. Had it not been for that extremely basic theme, I could see this being one of my favorites from the older titles. But for now, I think it's gonna earn a high B tier. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Boo slow you down here. But remember, we still have a whopping 3 retro tracks to talk about for Super Circuit. That's because this game decided to include every single Super Mario Kart track, and just make them worse. This is going to be really quick because these are essentially exactly the same as they were in Super Mario Kart, but instead of being 5 laps, they're just 3 now. That makes them much shorter than their original versions, and I think much worse as a result. The other main change I noticed has to do with the feather cuts. That's because the feather is dead. Now you can only take these with a mushroom, or you can actually make the jump if you're going fast enough. You could do that in the original version too, but it feels slightly easier and more realistic to actually pull it off in Super Circuit. Unfortunately, I think all 3 of the Ghost Valley remakes belong directly under their originals in the tier list because that lap cut thing is pretty bad. On to Mario Kart Double Dash. Where's the ghost track? The Mario Kart Double Dash Ghost track is lost media? Luckily for us, despite King Boo being a racer for the first time here, Double Dash didn't have any ghost tracks beside the battle map, which we aren't covering today. I say luckily because Nintendo, you still haven't put Double Dash on Switch Online! So that instead brings us to Mario Kart DS, which has 1 original and 1 retro ghost track. That original course being Luigi's Mansion. What a fantastic choice for a track, obviously being based on the game of the same name. Luigi's Mansion is definitely one of the more iconic Mario spin-off series, and its setting just works phenomenally in a Mario Kart game. We are finally free from the floating wooden boards as we have a much more lively track. Or dead track, I don't know. We start the race outside the mansion and have to drive up the path leading to the entrance. Already, this is such a great tone setter and fits well with the opening of the game it's based on. I love the exterior design with the green trees and gravestones lining the yard. I also love how slanted the drive up to the front of the mansion feels, as it makes it feel like it's looming much more creepily. As we enter inside, we immediately have to go down a ramp under a moving chandelier. Not only does that add to the haunted vibe, but so do all the paintings inside, which are actually based on paintings from the original game. Oh shoot, spoilers, Bowser's in it. After going down the ramps, we pretty much just have to drive straight through the dining room to get outside. Now, if there is one criticism I hear for this track, it's the fact that we don't get to spend much time inside the mansion itself. While I do think it could have been cool to be expanded on, I also like the variety this track as a whole provides. Once we do get outside, we get put into a graveyard, and since this is our first track of the video to have off-road, we can actually use some mushrooms to cut a bit of time. The graves being in the grass do a great job of making the cuts feel a bit more hidden and trickier to take. After the graveyard, we enter into the final stretch, which is a muddy, haunted forest. We first encounter a moving tree on the grass before we have to start dodging them while slipping in the mud. These guys are unique obstacles for just this track, and I like how it builds on the trees we've been seeing since the beginning. The mud also makes the gameplay here much more interesting as you try and drive toward the small patches of grass, but since that's where the trees like to stand, it can be a bit risky. But that pretty much brings us to the end, and wow, that was a massive upgrade. Not only do we get such a large variety of locations, but it actually uses the 3D space extremely well. Plus, I always like to see tracks that are actually based on things from the series. That way I can soy and point at my screen. I think it's safe to say that this is an easy S tier. It's the main ghost track carrying this theme from being completely mid. The song is also easily the best so far. Alright, onto DS's remake, we got another quick one with Banshee Boardwalk. Considering DS almost always picked the simplest tracks from each game to remake, it's really no surprise that Banshee Boardwalk is here. And on top of that, it's basically entirely unchanged. The only differences come from the aesthetic, and honestly, I think I might prefer the Mario Kart 64 version. Sure, the model for the fish is much better now, but there's something funnier about the N64 version for me. That's especially the case with the boos, which are now just flat images on the DS. The weird 3D models are what made the ghost illusions in the original so funny to me, so again, I think I have to give the point to that version. I do at least prefer the bats being turned into swoops now, but that's about it. The water is also much more visible on the DS, but I think that kind of takes away from how dark and gloomy the original was. So overall, I think Mario Kart 64 might just have the better version because of the aesthetics. Gameplay wise, these are both the same, so I'll put them back to back in C tier, but the original does get a slight edge for me. Mario Kart Wii is going to be a quick one as it only had one retro track in the form of SNES Ghost Valley 2. While this does unfortunately still suffer the same fate of the GBA version by only being 3 laps, they did at least make the track much bigger. That does also have the side effect of it being a whole lot easier to not fall off though. My Wii Classic controller broke, so I fell off anyway. I am still very happy that the walls can fall as you go, but it just won't come up as much as the original. As for the layout, there are actually 2 minor tweaks. First off, the feather shortcut is now just a ramp. I'm happy they at least kept it, but now it just feels way too easy. There's almost no reason to ever go the other way now. The other change I do like though is it adds a jump and a boost panel for the ending straightaway. This can make for some last second passes and saves the part of the track that I thought was the weakest part in the original. So all in all, this is obviously going right next to the original, but we need to figure out which is actually better. I think in this case, I slightly prefer the original actually. Not only did we get the full 5 laps and the feather cut, but the aesthetic just worked a lot better on the SNES. In Mario Kart Wii it looks bizarre, but not in a creepy way, more like the developers just didn't want to try and make a world surrounding it. I certainly wouldn't blame anyone if they put Wii higher, but for me, I think it is going to be just a slight bit below. Mario Kart 7 also brought with it one retro ghost track, but this time it's actually a good one, being Luigi's Mansion. Compared to the retros we've seen so far, this one actually got quite a few more changes. First up, the only negative change has to do with the paintings inside. While it is cool that they move now, it's a shame that they're only pictures of boos instead of the Luigi's Mansion references. Rest in peace, Chauncey. Again, I guess. The other changes though, I actually quite like. In the graveyard segment, not only can we find a glider ramp in the off-road, but the cemetery wall also has a hole in it, which means we can go through it for a shortcut. There was also a second glider ramp added right at the start of the mud portion. I do believe going down this route is slower, but it gives you an extra item set and helps you avoid the tree obstacles, so I like having the option. Overall, some pretty solid additions. Nothing groundbreaking, but this track clearly didn't need it seeing as it was already an S tier. That for me just makes the Mario Kart 7 version placed directly above it. Alright, now it's time for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which finally gives us another original Ghost track alongside a retro. That of course being Twisted Mansion, but I have always personally found this one to be a bit meh. Thematically, it's just meant to be a ghost house, which honestly does work fine since we haven't really gotten one yet. Sure, we obviously just had Luigi's Mansion, but we haven't had one on a standard Mario ghost house. The reason I find this one to be kind of mediocre comes down to the layout. I do really like how the track starts with the doors creaking open. It's a classic haunted house trope that I think sets the mood pretty well. Once we get inside, the twisted part of the name becomes a lot more clear as we have two wavy anti-gravity roads. Since ghost houses are meant to be supernatural and bizarre, anti-gravity fits the setting extremely well. These paths let us do a lot of tricks in order to give us a pretty fast-paced start. Coming off of those paths, we have probably my favorite shortcut of the video. Not because it's hard like what we saw in Broken Pier, I just think it fits the setting extremely well. Off to the left, we can see the scariest thing included in these tracks so far: books. You may notice though that there's actually a path through these bookshelves, so using a mushroom you can cut off a large chunk of this turn. It always feels really good to pull that off at the start of the race if you manage to get a mushroom. Unfortunately though, this is where the track really takes a bit of a nosedive. It's funny because I said dive and we're going in water. While it's kind of cool to have water to spruce up the setting, they don't really do anything with it while we're here. It's just very bland turns in water-filled corridors, and this lasts for a good chunk of the track. The fish bones that occasionally swim by can't even hurt us, so the only interesting thing here is the split path. However, so many other tracks in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe do this anti-gravity split path thing, and in much more interesting ways. On most other tracks it appears in, the paths are at least different colors to feel more special, but here they're both the same bland gray color. The choice really doesn't feel interesting at all, but I can at least give credit that jumping out of the water is pretty fun. The courtyard segment, while short, does a pretty good job of breaking up the aesthetic before we have to go back inside. We could do that from either the top floor or the bottom floor. Entering the top is definitely the faster method, but I like having the bottom open just in case you got hit while flying. We then have to exit the manor for one final turn, and I think the obstacles here are really cute. We have a couple statues lining the track with coins in front of them, but don't get too greedy. This adds a good bit of risk and reward for the final segment, as you could try and get a coin for extra speed or just finish out the race. The off-road at the end is also massive, so it opens up the opportunity for a lot of last-second mushroom comebacks, which at least keeps the track engaging until the final moment. Overall though, I think this track just has too long of a boring water segment that drags the whole track down. Outside the water, there are a few good ideas here, but it just feels like they didn't have quite enough to fill the layout. But compared to most of the totally flat tracks we've seen so far, this still earns a B tier. It's mostly that it just feels boring compared to the rest of 8 Deluxe's stellar track lineup. But at the very least, I can absolutely say that this has the best song yet. It feels perfectly eerie, but also high energy and fitting for a Mario Kart track. I personally use this song a lot in videos. We're not done with 8 Deluxe just yet though, as we still got one remake which came from the Booster Course Pass. That would be a remake of Boo Lake, and it's easily the most changed retro track in this video by far. For starters, they actually got the water.
Whoa!
It's still crazy that the original didn't have it, but hey, at least they fixed it in this remake. Not only does that water add to the aesthetic, it actually plays a part into the track's design. While Boo Lake starts pretty similar to the original, everything changes at the split path. While we do lose the ability to jump across the center, that's more than made up for by the next segment, which takes place completely in anti-gravity. When this track was released, that was pretty shocking to see due to the Booster Course Pass avoiding the anti-gravity mechanic as much as possible. Not only does that make the originally flat boards much more exciting to actually drive on, but it also leads super well to a jump into the water. Unlike the boring corridors we saw in Twisted Mansion, the underwater segment here is actually a lot of fun. The road is super jagged and takes great advantage of the anti-gravity. I also like how this covers the shortcut a bit by having the off-road connect at a weird angle. Then of course, once it's time to leave the water, we get some extremely sloped jumps, which obviously contrast quite a bit to the flat design seen in the original. Breaking through the water surface brings us to the end of the track, and it's safe to say that that was quite the improvement. Not only does the name make sense now, but the anti-gravity actually makes the layout significantly more interesting. This plays completely different from the original, but you can still very clearly tell that this is the same track. I think that's just about the perfect way to modernize a course, so I think this gets to place up an A tier. I also really like the remix of the song here too. But now it's time to end off the video with Mario Kart World's one and only ghost track, Boo Cinema. I'm not talking about the open world Ghost Valley, shut up. When this track was initially revealed, literally everyone said the exact same thing. It's absolute cinema. The theme of a haunted movie theater is completely different from all of the other tracks we've seen so far and sounds like it could lead to a super creative course. That's especially because of how many new fantastic gimmicks were added in Mario Kart World. Everything was looking great for this track to be an instant classic. Unfortunately, we all thought the second part of the name was so funny that we completely ignored the first part. Yeah, I think they sadly dropped the ball on this idea. We start the course by having to enter inside of the theater, but unfortunately, there's really not much to do. Then once we get into the actual screening, it's cute that we can see a ton of boos in the seats, but unfortunately, we can't interact with them at all. Instead, we just drive on a perfectly empty set of turns. Luckily, the track does pick up a bit after we jump into the actual screen. That idea fits perfectly in this supernatural setting, and I love that it even throws on a filter to make this portion feel like an old-timey horror movie. During this segment, we have to ride along some film reel of Peach being absolutely flabbergasted. This portion is definitely more interesting than what we've seen so far, with a lot more wavy turns to fit with this being on a film reel. I also like how at one point the ground starts to move, so you can actually see different frames in the movie playing out. I think that's a really cute detail. Sadly though, there's really not much to do or avoid here. You pretty much just follow the turns, and the only real thing you can do to mix it up is go onto this rail near the end. You can get some coins here, but okay, I think the behemoth showing up here as a jump scare was really cute. But yeah, the track itself just feels quite plain. There's no real shortcuts or obstacles, so once you've played the track a few times, the magic of the theme kind of wears off. Unfortunately, nothing at the ending helps much either. I think it was a great choice having us glide out of the screen, but from there, the race is basically over. So beside the fantastic cinema theming, the gameplay here is honestly quite plain. I can at least say that that theme makes it fun to go through for a bit, but after a few playthroughs, I feel like the magic does get lost. It sucks that they didn't add more parkour to the layout. They really had so much freedom to do whatever they wanted behind the screen, and they just didn't do anything interesting. So to end off the tier list, I think Boo Cinema belongs at the top of B tier. The aesthetic is great along with the fantastic song, but the gameplay just couldn't give it that push it really needed to be any higher. But anyways, that's it for this video. Are you obsessed with Ghost Valley 3 and Mario Kart Tour specifically and hate me for not mentioning it? Let me know in the comments. Okay, I yapped way more than I was expecting to about these tracks, but hopefully it was still enjoyable. I unfortunately am going to be stuck with a lot of college work for the rest of the semester, so I really apologize if my upload schedule gets a bit rough. Thank you all for being patient with me because I am kind of struggling to get all this work done, and your all support genuinely means the world. But before I go, I've got to thank my members being Stuffy Ant, Expired Crazy Person, RichDude29, Maidzio2, Jiho Jim, Linhard von Hevering, Fredbear's Diner, Magnus and Larslot, Trifector, Tibby, King Drybones, Mario Master 101, Hippopotamus, Levi Strux, Nuclear, Cassie Channel, Blessed Tiger, Wyatt Derpy, Yanni the Duck, Trader Mo, Mevins 2001, Enchanted Skull, SMA, B Major 2003, Sir Musty, Belandor, Cinder CC, Jade Avery, Pronto Clone, Thicky Reiki, Ungenio TM, CW McCain, Tesseract, JubeTube, Jameson Pageson, Z Frost, Concanut, Keep, and Christian Flattery Sequel Edition. But anyways, Drybones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.